Are you involved in a business or thinking about starting one? Do you know there may be environmental impacts from business activities? According to the Environmental Protection Act of 1996, businesses such as gas stations, rice mills, large-scale agriculture and poultry farms, large-scale mining and forestry operations, hotels, and resorts must be authorized. Persons proposing any of these activities need to submit an application for environmental authorization to the EPA. Hello and welcome to The Environment Matters, a monthly production of the Environmental Protection Agency in Guyana, where we explore the work of the agency in its quest to fulfill its mandate of environmental management and biodiversity conservation. I'm your hostess, Aretha Ford. Now, if you are viewing this program outside of Guyana, we celebrate Agriculture Month in the month of October, and this year's theme is championing food security through innovation, investment, and resilience. Agriculture is one of the most important productive sectors in Guyana and accounts for approximately 30% of our country's employment. Like other development activities, agricultural operations have an impact on the environment, both positive and negative, and it is therefore important that the EPA regulates this sector. So to enlighten us on this important role of the agency, I would like for us to welcome Mr. Ron Sullivan, who is a Senior Environmental Officer at the EPA, and he is the head of the Agriculture Unit. So Ron, welcome to the program.
Thank you, and good morning to your viewers.
All right. So before we get into the EPA's role in the agriculture sector, tell us about some of the environmental impacts of agriculture and why it's important for us to regulate that sector.
Okay, well, the agriculture sector, like any other productive sector in Guyana, utilizes natural resources in its production processes. And in fact, globally, agriculture utilizes about 70% of all the fresh water produced in the world, and about 15 billion hectares of land is under cultivation. So agriculture utilizes natural resources in a big way, water and land. In addition, some of the inputs used in the agriculture sector, for instance, pesticides and fertilizers, if not used in a judicious manner, can serve as a main source of pollutants that have negative environmental impacts. Further, the production processes itself, many of the agricultural production processes themselves produce significant quantities of waste. If not managed in an environmentally sustainable and responsible manner, can result in many of the environmental degradations, such as water pollution, air pollution, land pollution. So it is imperative that these sectors are managed in an environmentally responsible manner so as to provide minimum risk to human health and the environment. So there's where the EPA's role comes in. We ensure that developmental activities in this sector are managed in an environmentally responsible manner so as to minimize those environmental risks that I identified earlier.
Yes, and of course, one of our more important roles is to prevent and control pollution where possible. So we know that the EPA is responsible for issuing authorization for proposed and even existing projects, because we do from time to time have projects that were in existence before the passage of the Act. Can you tell us about the different categories or types of projects that are authorized by your unit, and what criteria, if someone comes in with a new project, what does that proposal need to have for it to be issued with authorization? Because in our previous program, viewers, we talked about the different types of environmental authorization, where we talked about sometimes persons would have no objection But before we get to that, let's talk about the types of projects that are authorized.
Okay. In the unit, some of the categories of projects, and I will go through a list. For agro-processing facilities, facilities such as rice mills, poultry processing facilities, meat and seafood processing facilities, abattoirs, feed manufacturing facilities. For livestock production, we have poultry rearing. If you're rearing 500 heads and above, those facilities would need to be authorized. For sheep and goat, 70 heads, cattle, 70 heads, and swine operations, 70 heads and above. For crop farms, large crop farms that are 1,000 acres and above, and all aquaculture and mariculture operations, and wildlife holding stations. Those
All right.
are the major categories of projects
Good.
that are
So
authorized by the unit.
I want to backtrack a little. When you talk about mariculture, what do we mean when we
It's
reference
basically
mariculture?
the practice of using seawater or brackish water for aquaculture purposes.
Okay, and this differs from aquaculture. How?
Aquaculture mainly uses fresh water.
Fresh water. Okay, that's an interesting distinction for those who don't have that depth of knowledge about the agriculture sector. That's pretty interesting. All right, so I wanted for us to make the distinction because we did have in one of our previous programs the head of the industry and manufacturing unit on the program, and she mentioned that her unit is responsible for authorizing operations that also deal with food products. Well, let's make the distinction between what your unit authorizes and what Ms. Duncan's unit authorizes.
Okay, well, in terms of food production, we're speaking specifically about feed manufacturing. So it's not food for human consumption, but for
Okay.
animals. So that is the major difference. We authorize feed manufacturing facilities.
Okay. I think it's important that we look at both aspects because at the end of the day, we consume the animals. So we want to ensure that what is put into those animals is safe for their consumption so that when we consume those animals,
Yes.
our health is also protected. So, but nonetheless, regardless of whether, the authorization is for the production of food for animals or food for human consumption, it goes through one process. And, in previous productions, we would have talked about that process. So, of course, I know, Ron, you would want to urge developers or persons who are thinking about starting an agricultural operation that fits the criteria that you just mentioned, for them to apply to the EPA for authorization. It starts with that. In your sector, is there any unique or specific document in addition to the regular things that we ask for that needs to be submitted?
For instance, if you're doing an aquaculture operation, you will have to have the necessary permissions from the fisheries department to have that operation submitted. So in addition, the regular stuff such as CHMP approval, the NDC no objection letter, and the other documents, those are required.
The maps of your
The maps of the surrounding area, and site suitability maps, and site plan. Of course, your ID and the application.
Yes, and then of course, we would have talked previously about when an environmental impact assessment is needed as opposed to when it's not needed, and the different steps through that process. So I hope viewers that you have that in the back of your mind when you are thinking about applying for environmental authorization. So before we take an ad break, is there anything else that you would like to remind developers and our viewers about when it comes to agricultural operations and the EPA's regulation of the sector?
Well, I would encourage those farmers that agriculture does have an impact on the environment. And as I mentioned earlier, some of those impacts can be very deleterious to the environment and human health. So if you intend on starting these operations, the first step is to submit an application to the agency so that we can regulate that sector and so as to minimize the impacts of that operation on the environment and human health.
All right, great. Thank you, Ron. So it's time for our first ad break. Stay tuned. You are watching The Environment Matters.
Gosh,
Morning, Miss Sonia.
morning, Miss Cheryl. I'm late for work.
I noticed the other day y'all had a big campaign with them police officers, so shutting down them people barbecue, wedding, dance. Man, how y'all expect these people to make money and survive?
Oh, Miss Cheryl, that is far from the truth. The EPA and the Guyana Police Force are actually working together to ensure that persons who conduct certain businesses and activities are authorized. We've tried to allow them to adhere to the noise regulations.
Well, this gonna be a new law. What law is this?
These laws were always in place. It's now that we're getting all these complaints at the agency, we are trying to enforce them. The Environmental Protection Act has been in place since 1996, and it states that persons and businesses must apply for environmental authorization before operating a sound-making device.
Well, girl, I never know this thing is prior to the law.
So if you're keeping a barbecue or an open-air function, like a wedding or a concert, especially in your community, right, and you're playing a music system, you have to apply for a short-term noise permit. And for persons that operate in a business and you got generators and stuff, you have to apply for a long-term permit. And that is applicable to bars and hotspots and clubs also.
Well, now that you explain it, I understand it. It's unfair to the elderly, sick people, and even them little children.
That is correct. According to the World Health Organization, loud noise can cause stress, sleep deprivation, and hearing impairment. And I'm sure you wouldn't want that.
Oh, now I understand. Thank you for explaining it, Miss Sonia.
For more information, you can contact the EPA at 225-5471 or visit our office at Ganji Street, North Sophia, Georgetown.
Do you have an environmental complaint? Then the Environmental Protection Agency wishes to advise that you can report an environmental complaint at the agency via one of the following. You can call our 24-hour hotline number at 225-5469, or you can drop us an email at complaints@epaguyana.org. Or you can message us on our Facebook page at EPA Guyana, or you can message us directly on Instagram at EPAGY. Please note, when submitting an environmental complaint, you would need to submit the following: name of complainant, that is the person who is making the complaint, the address of that person, a contact number, as well as the alleged polluter, a name for them, or a name of their business, their location, and the nature of the complaint. For further information, you can visit our agency's head office at Ganji Street, Sophia, or you can visit one of the regional offices to make your environmental complaint. You can visit our WIM office in the Quarantine or our Linden office in the Lynn Building, Mackenzie, Linden. Please note that all information collected from the public will be treated with the strictest confidence. However, complainants should be willing to attend court and testify should the matter require legal action.
Welcome back to The Environment Matters. If you're now joining us, during the first half of our program, Mr. Ron Sullivan, head of the Agriculture Unit at the Environmental Protection Agency in Guyana, enlightened us about some of the environmental impacts of agriculture and how the agency authorizes projects in that sector. So, Ron, let's continue our conversation by talking about some guidelines that the EPA has for the sector, and then we can go a bit into complaints management, because I feel like now, we have to talk about some of the issues that arise from operations in this sector and what the EPA is doing to address those issues that are brought to us by the public. So let's backtrack a bit and talk about the guidelines, and you'll tell us what those are.
Okay, there are two guidelines that have been developed specifically to look at the management of poultry operations and swine operations. These two sectors are very important because they produce significant quantities of waste that, if not managed properly, can result in serious environmental harm, odor nuisance, and etc. So the two guidelines that were prepared give best practices on how these sectors should operate to minimize their environmental impact and their environmental impact
And the
on the environmental impact and human health risk. So those guidelines will guide farmers and other stakeholders as to what are the best practices to operate in these sectors.
All right, so let's touch a bit on both of the guidelines and what are some of the more important things. Of course, everything in the guideline is important. As one of the persons at the agency who interfaces with the public, what I see in many of our complaints would be odor nuisances from these operations, as well as waste, as you identified, would be the issue that is really pervasive. So how can operators then minimize? Share with us, please.
Yeah, well, the first thing, those types of operations should be located in areas that are zoned for agricultural purposes. And I want to stress the point that about more than 50% of our complaints occur in areas that, like residential type of areas, emanate from that type of setting. And we encourage persons to apply to CHMPA if you want to start such an operation, to see if the area will be suitable for that type of operation. But we discourage developmental activities of those nature in residential areas. So firstly, it should be located in areas that are zoned for that purpose.
Yes, and I agree with you, Ron, because when you talked about zoning in the areas, right away, my mind came to a friend of mine who asked, he's like, I want to buy 2 chickens and, I think 2 birds and stuff. And I know you work at EPA, so is it okay if I do that? And right away I said, no, because 2 chickens then turn into 5, into 10, and before you know it, there are more than 50 birds, there are more than 100 birds, and it's right next door to somebody's home, and you get that smell that often can't be avoided. So even before you think about, Christmas is around the corner, maybe I want to have a couple of meat birds, think about the persons next to you, behind you, in front of you, who will be affected by your operation. Ensure that you do things in the correct way, and of course apply to the Central Housing and Planning Authority to ensure that you're doing things in the right zone. So zoning, of course, is very important.
The guidelines themselves give step-by-step guide as to how you can reduce things such as odor, how you manage your waste on site. But given that together, there would not be zero impacts or zero occurrences of some of these issues that I spoke about earlier. But the guidelines gives details as to how some of those impacts can be managed. But I want to reiterate that those activities ideally should be done in areas that are suitable for such operations. And for instance, let me give a practical example of what I'm talking about. For poultry rearing operations, we recommend a you should be at least 250 meters downwind of any, to the nearest school, hospital, or resident. So there should be a buffer zone between your operation and your operation and residents per se. So it's not recommended that you do this development smack in the middle of a residential area. There are certain setbacks and boundaries that should be respected for these operations to operate under.
All right. So, for someone who is rearing chickens, for example, what are some of the best practices that can be utilized to reduce odor nuisance and to reduce, well, waste is something that is ever present, but what can they do to dispose of their waste in the correct manner? So we started the odor nuisance.
Okay. Some of the issues with odor nuisance has to do with how wetted the pens are. So you need to turn your litter as often as possible, and in those areas where, especially around where the waterers are, you top up those areas on a regular basis with fresh materials so that the area remains as dry as practicable. Okay. So those are like some of the major issues, and you should ensure that as soon as if it's poultry, broiler birds you're dealing with, when you're finished with that batch, the pens are clean and the litter from that pen is disposed of in an environmentally safe manner.
All right. So I can only imagine, because you're talking about keeping that area dry. So how do they manage during the wet season or the rainy season?
Ideally, your pen the base of the pen should be concreted. And if you were located in a flood-prone area, the pen should be elevated, ideally, so as to minimize the risk of that pen becoming wetted. And of course, daily management to ensure that essentially have that area dried.
All right. So another important point is the disposal of waste. How should persons dispose of the carcasses? How do they dispose of the fecal matter that the birds produce, feathers, etc.?
Well, some of the options for waste disposal include composting on site. And that comes back to the point that I made earlier, to having these operations in areas that are zoned for those purposes. So if you can have an on-site composting facility, or you could designate a particular area on site where you can bury dead animals, or you can have an incinerator to deal with most of the waste. But the practice of just sometimes just giving the material to farmers can create other problems as well, because where these material might be going, the farmers might not be storing it in a safe manner, and it can create further environmental problems. So one of the major ways that we recommend is to have a compost on site and have a controlled compost, so that those materials can be recycled on site on your farm.
Great. And so the guidelines for swine rearing operations, when we talk again about odor control, do the same principles apply in terms of keeping the area dry? And when we talk about disposal of waste, how does that differ from the poultry rearing?
For swine rearing operations, most of the farmers utilize washing down the pens on a daily basis. What we would recommend, firstly, before you do that, you remove the solids, and the same principle of composting. So most of the solids would have been removed from the pen before it is washed down. So a compost on site can serve as a source of disposal of most of those materials.
Okay. So ideally, we want to promote composting as the best method of that particular type of waste disposal.
Correct.
Yes. Yes, and as viewers, if you tune to us often enough, you know that composting is something that I regularly advocate for, you know, especially if you have your own little kitchen garden, etc. All right, so we want to come to complaints management. We know that noise is our main source of environmental complaints, and you know, based on the figures that I see in house, agriculture follows not too far behind. What are the types of complaints that you receive from members of the public?
Well, 90%, I can tell you I have about 90% of all agricultural complaints are related to odor nuisance. So the point that I made earlier regarding management of waste in these two sectors are very important to reducing this impact. So in terms of odor nuisance from poultry rearing and swine rearing operations. So that is why we have been focusing heavily on looking at practical measures that persons can use, of course, to deal with their waste in an environmentally safe and responsible manner. And that is one of the ways of reducing odor nuisance. Proper waste management and dealing with and you have a setback if you're not being located in
The correct zone.
being located in the correct zone.
All right. So before we bring our program to a close, we always talk about capacity building, right? The EPA has one of its largest training budgets since its establishment. So can you talk about some of the training that the staff would have undergone throughout the year?
We have dealing with the issue of waste management again. We saw it as a very important issue that needed to be addressed. So we have focused on two specialist training programs that were executed for the year to build the staff's capacity. The first program dealt with looking at manure management, on-farm manure management, and some of those low-cost systems that are applicable in a Guyana context. So that's one of the training that staff were able to. So it wasn't just a theoretical training, but staff actually had an opportunity to visit a site and actually practice some of those disposal methods that I spoke about: composting, vermicomposting, that.
All right, so different composting methods that are available. Are there any programs in the pipeline for training of staff?
The second training I forgot to mention, we also did a training on agro-processing waste. Like, what are the best management practices for wastewater that comes from agro-processing, like fish processing facilities, poultry processing. So dealing with the wastewater that comes off of these facilities, what were some of the technologies available, what were some of the best practices. So that was another training that the staff benefited from. And out of this particular training, a third training was recommended where we're going to be looking at constructed wetlands as one of those solutions to deal with that's suitable in a Guyana context to deal with agro-processing waste. So the training is expected to be here next week, and we'll have a detailed training program regarding how constructed wetlands will work for that purpose in terms of dealing with agro-processed waste water.
That's excellent.
Yes.
All right. So before we close off, do you have any tips, any words of advice that you would like to share, not only with operators, but with members of the public?
I would encourage members of the public, if you would like to start any type of agricultural operation, please consult the agency. We can advise you and we can guide you accordingly into having these operations operate in a safe and environmentally responsible manner. So I will encourage them to visit the agency or call in for advice if you're thinking about starting such an operation. Thank you.
All right. Yes, thank you so much, Mr. Ron Sullivan, Head of the Agriculture Unit at EPA. And if you're thinking about starting an agricultural operation, you can visit any one of our offices or head offices in Georgetown at Ganji Street, Sophia. We have our Berbice office located in Wim, right next to the post office, and we have our Linden branch in the Len Building, Mackenzie. Of course, you can access the EPA on our social media platforms. Ensure that you like and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and stay in touch with the agency by reading our weekly newspaper column in the Guyana Times and the Sunday Chronicle. You can view this program on your favorite channel, NCN Channel 11. Stay tuned to your radio for our bi-weekly interviews. And remember to stay safe and respect each other and the environment. Thank you for watching.
At the Environmental Protection Agency, we believe that the environment is everybody's business. We can start caring for our planet by becoming more environmentally friendly in our everyday actions. Here's what you can do. Dispose of waste in a garbage bin. Clean our drains, yards, and carpets regularly. Take a reusable shopping bag to the market. Support local butchers and farmers to reduce packaged waste. Plant a kitchen garden, trees, and flowers. Compost your organic waste. Conserve water and electricity. Carry a reusable water bottle. These little acts are good for your health and that of the environment. Remember, healthy people work better and achieve more, and together, small actions make a big difference. For further information on how you can help, please contact the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, Ganji Street, Sophia, or telephone us at 225-5467. You can also visit our website, epagana.org, or our Facebook and Instagram pages.